welcome to the March edition of HR Hot Topics. I'm your host, Jody Schaefer, and my aim is to make this the most informative 5-ish minutes of your month. As you can tell from the lighting and the professional imagery, Will's back. So Will's feeling better back behind the camera. So glad to be back to our normal status quo here at HR Hot Topics. And this month, I've got a couple things I want to talk through with you. One, I just came back from a presentation I did on setting healthy boundaries and emotional professionalism, both of which I thought were really important topics for all of you to hear a little bit more about. I also want to update you on a few legislative compliance changes, one that is probably going to happen, the other one it's a wait and see. And then I want to give you the final survey results because many of you were so kind as to provide us your feedback on the topics that you want to see us to do deep dives on. And so I've got those results. I'll share them with you today too. So first, let's talk about the topic at hand, which is healthy boundary setting. I think this is incredibly important because many of us are trying to manage personal lives, and work lives, and especially if you're in a situation where you're working in a hybrid or a remote environment, those two things have blurred in a way that they have previously never blurred before. And the boundary setting is something I think all of us, when it comes to our own personal boundaries, we understand the value of them, but when we push up against somebody else's boundary, it can create some pushback and some frustration, both for the individual who feels like you've crossed over and asked too much of them, and for the person doing the asking, feeling like perhaps the ask wasn't that big, right? So how do you navigate that space? I'm going to link you to a podcast that Brene Brown did on her Dare to Lead. She's got this podcast series. Brene Brown is a wonderful author. She's done a lot of work in the leadership space and a lot of work around the topic of shame. But it's Brene Brown, Adam Grant, Simon Sinek. So if any of those names sound familiar to you, imagine all three of them jam-packed into a conversation together. And that's exactly what this podcast was. In fact, it was so good, they split it into a 2-part series. Each of them is like 45 minutes long. And it's free on Spotify, which is amazing, right? So I'm going to connect you with a link to that. But part of what I'm going to talk about today comes from this back and forth conversation with Brene, Adam, and Simon talking about boundaries. And often we think of boundaries as a limit or a line that we don't want someone to cross. And what Brene said is that actually healthy boundaries are partially that, what we don't want to do, but there's a whole other component, which is what we will do, what is okay. So it's not just what's out of bounds, but it's also defining for somebody what is in bounds. And so I love that thought that this is more than just a no. And the no's are easy, but trying to figure out what the yeses are takes a little bit more discernment. And that's part of emotional professionalism, because sometimes as an employer, you're going to require more of a staff member than what they would typically want to give. Maybe you're asking them to work later than they would typically want to work. Maybe you're asking them to forego that vacation request they wanted to put in because you've got something coming up and you really need their help with it. Maybe your practice has fallen on hard times and you're not able to give increases this year. You know, there's this give and take. And so Simon Sinek, who's part of this conversation on the podcast, he described healthy boundary setting as a negotiation. And I love that thought of it too, that it's not so rigid as we often consider it ourselves, that actually it's I'm asking something of you, you're deciding whether or not you can make that work, and you might have to stretch this time, right? But then on the back end, if I'm the leader and I'm asking you to stretch and do something outside of the norm, I'm going to recognize that you've done that. And then where I can, I'm going to give you leeway somewhere else so that on the whole, right, on the balance, we both feel like our needs are being met. And that's a really important part. And that's where the healthy part of healthy boundary settings comes into play, that it's really two individuals and it's a back and forth. It's a negotiation. And they're a lot more flexible than I think we sometimes know, because we just focus on what we won't do, right? And that's not realistic in the workplace. And so I love Brene's idea of what is okay and what is not okay. And the example she gives is, it's okay that you were upset in that meeting. It's not okay to slam your fists on the table because you're upset, right? And so that, again, is an example of emotional professionalism. And as leaders, oftentimes, not only do we have to make sure that we are setting examples in this area, but that we have the language to help our employees or those that we're around and that we support, that they can understand these concepts in a more comprehensive way too. And so the is okay, isn't okay is one of the ways that you can do that. And then I'll just leave you with this final bit, which I loved. And this is from Adam Grant. This was kind of his contribution to the piece. He talks about this improv game called Should Have Said. And basically, it's a way to give the person a do-over if you don't like the way the words came out of their mouth. And he said, wouldn't it be great if that became a norm in our companies, that when somebody asks for something and it's delivered in a way that sets up this, yes, no sort of paradigm, rather than a negotiation, right? Instead of will I, won't I, it's how do I? So when the words don't come out in a way that sets up that conversation and that negotiation, you as the person on the receiving end could say, should have said, right? As a way of saying, I hear, I get the intent, but I'm gonna let you try that again so that the words are better received on this end. And it's a way of coaching and counseling your team members, right? So I loved that should have said example. Because sometimes words come out of our mouth and when we have a minute to think about it, we think, I could have done that better. And so you could ask for a do-over almost. Or again, if the person doesn't realize that they could have said or done that better, you could cue them in just with that phrase, should have said, right? So a few thoughts there, but on this idea of healthy boundaries, I see this more and more, especially with younger workers that don't have a lot of experience in the workplace, but they know how they want work and life to feel. And so are real quick to say, nope, that's a boundary for me, hard and fast. And because the labor shortage is what it is, the employees have a lot of power right now. And so those boundaries for an employer might feel like no, no, no. And really there is much more or needs to be much more wiggle room there, but sometimes it's the approach and the language we use to try to make sure that we're giving and receiving in that area. So that's the topic for tomorrow. Like I said, I will link to that podcast and some other articles that I think are of interest on this topic. Now to the two updates I wanted to share with you. One of them has to do with a Michigan law, a current Michigan law. The Elliott-Larsen Civil Rights Act has been on the books for many, many years. It's the state equivalent to the federal civil rights law. And there is a Senate Bill 4, to take a federal Supreme Court ruling and a state Supreme Court ruling that said sex as a protected classification is to include sexual orientation and gender identity, and to codify that in the Elliott-Larsen Civil Rights Act for our state. So we already had a federal and a state Supreme Court ruling that said this is the law of the land and this is how you're supposed to interpret sex, but there's a push to make sure that that language is just very clearly defined in our state statute. That Senate bill passed yesterday. We're filming this on the 2nd of March, so that passed yesterday, March 1st. It now goes to the House, where it is expected to pass, as the Dems do have a slight majority in the House. By the way, this was a bipartisan bill, so we expect it to pass in the House, and the governor's already signaled her support for it, so you will probably see that coming. The second thing I wanted to just put on your radar, for those of you that use non-competes within your place of business, at the federal level right now, the Federal Trade Commission is proposing a rule that would ban all non-competes for all employers, all independent contractors, and rescind any existing non-competes that may be in effect. And this could also impact collective bargaining agreements. So that proposed rule that would ban non-competes is open right now for public comment. It'll be open until the 20th of this month for public comment. And then the FTC is going to review those comments. They may make slight changes to the proposed language, and then it would become a final rule. And then, of course, it would be up to the courts to decide whether or not the rule is enforceable. So it's not a done deal yet, but if you're using non-competes, I wanted to put this on your radar. You should be following this pretty closely. Finally, survey results. And thank you to all of you who took a few minutes to tell us which topics you want to hear more about. I can tell you that the top vote getters were workplace culture, employee engagement, team building, managing different generations in the workforce, and employee evaluations and feedback. So we will work this year to make sure that we hit on those topics. But the first one we're actually going to do is, unfortunately, the result of the shooting that happened at Michigan State University last month. And just another example of the ongoing difficulties in our world and how that trauma and that emotional toll affects us personally and professionally. We don't leave our humanity at home when we go to work. And as an employer, as a leader within an organization, you're dealing with your own responses to tragedies like that, like COVID, like loss of a loved one, right? And there are many, many things happening in our world that have emotional baggage for all of us. But as a leader, you're trying to manage your own, and then you're trying to figure out how to be there for your employees, and where is the line, and what are the tools. And so in light of MSU and some specific questions I had come in from clients, our first deep dive video is going to be on trauma, managing trauma in the workplace. And I have some really fantastic guests lined up, one of which is an expert in this field. And so I cannot wait to have this conversation. It's just so needed. And I think for all of you that are dealing with this, it will feel like a breath of fresh air, something you can actually tangibly hold on to and start to make some inroads in a really difficult time, something that nobody's really equipped to do in the workplace. So that's our goal. That's going to be the first deep dive session that we launch. So if you're not on the mailing list, you're going to want to join so that you get access to that. Again, these are free. But look for that. We're going to shoot it next month, actually, in early April, and then it will be ready for release late April, early May. So again, thanks for the feedback. Appreciate it. Stay tuned to learn more from us, as always. And if you've got questions, you can reach me, Jody Schaefer, at workwithhrm.com.